walking up toward the gates, we could see that many creatures, similar to our own, were getting on top of the ramparts and getting their weapons ready. We saw many spears and blades, of course, but we also saw bows and a couple of crossbows, all docked and ready to rock. We were nervous about that, but of course we could see more nervousness with the fact that we had actual firearms. I looked around and did finally see one. It was a MP5 being held by another red guy similar to, or was that a girl? I can't tell from here. Similar to Bill. Yet, we begin to walk up. I slung the weapon across my back, raised my hands, and told everyone else to hold off until I actually talked to these folks. What I didn't know was Bill had decided to walk up behind me as well. I walked up to the gate and asked, "Who's in charge?" After a few moments, a feminine voice came across and said, "What do you want?" I responded, "We're looking for sanctuary for the night." There was another long pause, and the female voice came out. "Just for the night. However, you have to leave those weapons outside." I responded, "Ma'am, there are some really dangerous things out there. I cannot in good conscience tell my people to disarm themselves." "Well, then you're not coming inside," she said. "Well, ma'am, I'm asking you, please, one night so that we can rest before we move on." Hesitantly, she must have been talking to someone because she paused and responded, "All right, one day, 24 hours. You need to leave by noon tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am, I will let my people know." As I turned around, I almost slammed face first into Bill as he was standing there listening intently. We went back and told everybody what was going on, and I told them to make sure they holstered or hid or reslung their weapons so that it didn't make the locals nervous. As we walked up, the large gates opened, but the ramparts on top stayed strong as others were just above us watching. We came inside, haggard, tired, and I asked where we could go to rest. We were led to a shack on the far end of the compound, and immediately I told the women and children to relax while we settled things with the town. It took a little bit, but we were able to barter for food and a few supplies. Our barter, of course, was weapons and pretty much nothing else, as we didn't have anything else to barter with. Our clothes were haggard, we didn't have any resources to trade with, and any we had to hold on to. However, they were more than willing to trade for weapons, and especially ammo, as now those things were very sparse and very hard to find. We didn't argue much. It was just good to spend a night where we didn't have to worry about being attacked or eaten. While everyone slept, several of us talked with the leader and her other compatriots about what had happened. They were just as confused about what happened around the world as the rest of us. However, what they do know is that their situation was slightly different than ours. They had woken approximately a year and a half to 2 years ago, but they did not trickle in like we did. They did not have to wait for other pods to open, but instead all their pods opened at the same time. The same sludge all over them. As everyone coughed and gagged, they had to deal with the rush of creatures that were no longer within their right mind. Flying creatures that seemed to gallop for the door, trying to shake off the sludge. Other creatures obsessed with eating would suddenly grab the ones next to them and bite them and start eating their flesh while they screamed in pain. They had a couple of those spiderish monsters. They even mentioned a strange type of insect that ran across the ground extremely fast, and when they described it, we knew it was the same bugs that had attacked us, and we explained that to them as well. They explained that they had been building this facility, this compound, so that they could protect themselves from what was out there. We couldn't disagree. The walls themselves were designed to stop those large ogre-type creatures, the trolls, as they put them, from getting inside. When we told them we had stopped the troll, they actually laughed at us, but we explained what had happened, and of course a bullet to the eye was enough for us to explain. Later on that night, it was just me and the one in charge as we spoke. Very candidly, she explained how she just could not allow everyone to stay. Not a large group like that. There would be a lot of issues, not only with supply, but with housing, and the fact that holding on to everyone was tenuous at best. She may be the one in charge, but she was no queen. No one called her Your Majesty or any of that crap like that, nor did anybody want to. The leader itself was elected and could not be removed unless the trial that had caused potential discord was taken care of. You couldn't just remove someone and throw someone in there you like just for the hell of it. It doesn't work that way. When she was done explaining, she asked how I became leader of my group, and I explained it just kind of happened. I was one of the first ones to wake up, and I was the first one to start bringing everybody together, so I guess that's the way it is. She smiled and said, of course. Of course, it just happens that way. It always happens that way, the first generation. I kind of had to smile a little bit as it was. As we talked, I began to preach about how we still needed some sort of sanctuary. We asked, could this be our sanctuary? She pondered for a long time, realizing that we had young ones with us, but eventually she answered no. This would not be your sanctuary. It was theirs, of course, but unless they had something to bring, something to barter, something to trade, there was no way they could keep a group as large as ours longer than the one day. I again thanked her for her kindness and her bluntness on the subject, as beating around the bush was not something you could do these days. The next morning, we woke up to, thankfully, the kids playing outside. I began to gather everyone up, and we asked for an extra little bit of supplies, anything they could give to us to help us out. Unfortunately, the only thing they could help us out with was a couple extra bags that we could use to collect goods with as we were out. This was good enough for now, although it was very disheartening to try to explain to the children they could not stay here where it was safe. We may only have a couple of kids, but it was enough when they started to cry that I wanted to console them, but being a counselor is not something I've ever been. Thankfully, some of the women were able to help them along. As we left, it was again disheartening. Not a lot was said, except for good luck as we left. I led them out. I tried to keep morale up as best I could, but morale was in the shithouse now. As we continued to walk, I realized that we were going down the same road, and we hadn't seen anything in a while. I asked if anybody could draw, if they could end up drawing a map for us so we didn't go over the same things twice. Thankfully, two that could draw really well put their heads together and were able to put something very well illustrated together by the beginning of the next day. This surprised us a lot. However, the beginning of the next day brought another interesting fact. As we walked the road, some of the others who had very strong senses of smell started sniffing the air, started asking, "The hell is that?" I had no idea. I asked them to lead us to where they could smell whatever it was. They led us over, and I began to smell it, and it was strong. Once I got one strong whiff, I knew what it was, as my time in the service had let me know exactly what a blown open body smells like. I told everybody to be ready, as I brought the weapon up to my shoulder, and I told everyone stay behind us, as I told everyone with a long gun to come up to the front. We began to encircle those who did not have weapons to protect them. And as soon as we broke through a little bit of tree line, there was a small valley right there, a small opening. And we looked and we saw the troll. It was laying face down in the ground. At first, we were wondering if it was still alive. However, we realized what was on top of the troll, and it scared the living shit out of us. There was winged creatures tearing it open. They had talons on their feet that reached down and with one swipe would rip open the troll's skin, the skin strong enough to bounce bullets off of. Even though these weren't high caliber bullets, it was still surprising that it could do so. They could still cut it open, and then they reached down with their winged arms, and with several different appendages about halfway down the wings, began to rip the flesh out and shove it in their face. Speaking of which, when I pulled out my binoculars and looked, I realized that the binoculars had actually been half broken. However, using one side, I could see that these things were mostly human. The wings were birdish, of course. The feet were not feet anymore, as they seemed to be a type of talon, very similar to what you would see on some sort of raptor. But the rest of the body was entirely human. And they seemed to be conversing with each other, although we weren't close enough to really hear them. I turned around and I told everybody what we'd seen, and it was decided that we would leave them be for now. If the troll was dead, it was just one less thing we had to worry about. And of course, those flying things were too busy eating to give any sort of shit about us. We continued down the road, and we finally found another one of the facilities. This one was not busted open. In actuality, we had to break our way in. Breaking the locking mechanism on the front doors was not too hard once we got a few people behind it, and then shoving a branch in between the handles on the other side was an easy way of making sure that no one got in. As a few relaxed, those of us that were pulling security went around to see if we were actually alone in this facility. We all remembered what happened the last time we thought everything was clear. However, this time, we didn't hear any. Moving around the first floor, we found, of course, a reception desk, waiting areas, a whole bunch of offices, what looked like medical equipment, and not much else. There was a small break room, and we were able to break open the still loaded vending machine, which surprised the hell out of us. And we were able to hand out some treats to everyone. I told them we didn't have time to sit and wait. Those of us that had to search right now. So leaving a small security contingent with it, we still kept going. The second floor, of course, was offices as we expected. No break room this time, unfortunately, but we did end up breaking open some of the office furniture to make sure there was enough for a fire, as we would be staying here this night. We began to open up all the drawers, and of course it was full of files. We couldn't boot up the computers as there was absolutely no power, so we couldn't see what actually happened. To our surprise, we found another newspaper. I was still surprised the newspapers were still a thing around there. But this time the date was different. It was almost a week past when the other paper was found. It says, "Monsters have taken over." Not monsters are among us, but monsters have taken over. The blurred picture showed several of the larger monsters. Down way in the back, I could see a minotaur type monster. Another one was a type of ogreish. But as you saw, there was a large foot. It was a large foot of a troll. How in the hell? It was going through a small town, and it was tearing buildings apart. The picture showed as the arm had grabbed the top of the roof of a building and simply ripped it off to one side, debris still flying through the air. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. How could this happen? How? What? When? Huh? We still couldn't figure it out. But then again, we started reading more, and we got a big piece of the puzzle. There was word in there about a strange galactic event. It was like a CME on crack. In other words, a solar flare that went way off its rails. Something had happened to the power grid, and only certain portions of the world were still active. Many areas were completely without internet, others were completely without power. Only anything with backup generators was working. This, of course, meant that the newspapers, surprisingly, were one of the only ways of getting information out. We all chuckled at the realization. Yet, we continued reading, as one of our number read it out loud. How things had been gotten bad to worse. Entire areas of the country were now quarantine zones. The National Guard and the rest of the military had done their best to try and wipe everything out, but It seemed as though they were smart. We looked at each other and said, "What, they think we're stupid?" I looked at Bill, smacked him on the arm for that one, but it was true. We had realized that many of the monsters that had come out were not like us. We may be monsters in the eyes of humans, but we're still human, I think, as far as intelligence goes. Once we finished up with the newspaper, one of our friends brought it down to everyone else so they could read it, and we continued our search. This time, we went to the basements. And yes, it turned out to be plural. It wasn't just one sub-basement. It was 4 levels. One of which had an entire stocked cafeteria, though the whole place reeked of rotten food. And of course, there were a few rats running around. But there was still plenty of food that was preserved. Much in cans, much dehydrated pastas and things like that. And we realized that we could hold up here for a while. We realized that this could be our sanctuary. Could it possibly be? We then realized that on the second level was a whole bunch of bunks. This was a fallout shelter. We realized that some of the beds clearly had been used. We looked around to see if there was anyone, but we couldn't find anyone. There was no trace of anyone. No blood, no fluid, no bodies, no nothing. We didn't figure it out. On the next level was a whole bunch of equipment used to keep the facility running. Generators that had run dry. Sewage pipes ran all across the wall next to electrical conduits and things of that nature. There was no way we could get power, so most of that was out. We didn't know where we could get any type of fuel. However, we wondered if we could find maybe an old diesel station, as diesel tends to last a lot longer. Maybe we could get things running again. It was decided that we would hold up. However, we were surprised and hesitant to stay there when we found what was on the final sub-basement. The 4th level down was a large, empty room. Very large. Large as the entire building, with several pillars clearly designed to hold the rest of the sub-basement above. And on the far side of the wall was another one of those blast doors. A giant square piece of metal. We looked around and we couldn't find anything else in there, except for something on the floor. I remember I got called over, "Hey, do you know what this is?" And I looked close. We had to bring a few of our torches over, and eventually we pulled out the flashlight we were trying to save the batteries on, clicked it on, and immediately recognized what we were looking at. These were tire tracks. We looked closer and closer and realized that the tire tracks led from one side to the other. The opposite side of the blast door, we realized there was a ramp that led to the top. This was a storage facility for vehicles, but where the hell were the vehicles? Why aren't they here? Where'd they go? We looked over and we could see type of caterpillar tracks from maybe equipment, maybe it was from tanks. It was hard to tell because they all looked very similar. But it was clear that whoever had wanted to get out of here in one hell of a hurry. That's when we started looking around for anything else, any type of tools, any type of fuel cans, any type of anything. But the room had been stripped. It was like it was all prepared to move and everyone just hopped in and ran. Efficient, I thought. We walked back over to the large blast door, and thankfully our former security friend here still had all those badges. He tried swiping them, but of course nothing happened. There was no power going to the external console. We couldn't figure out what was wrong. But we figured if nothing could get in, nothing could get out. When we left, we made sure that the doors were blockaded somehow. Just in case something did come out of the blast doors, we would know what the hell was going on, and at least we would have some time before whatever it was came to us. We went over to the crowd and we told them what we'd found, and they were elated at the idea that they finally did find some sort of sanctuary. Thankfully, we could rest in peace out here without worrying about something coming in. We led everybody to the sub-basements where they enjoyed some food. We had to start fires, of course, to boil everything up on the upper floors, and we had to sleep by candlelight, but it didn't matter. Everyone was just so grateful. We had to leave the doors open to make sure airflow, of course, but no one cared. The first time they had slept on an actual bed since this all started. Anything beyond that house that we had found. It was wonderful to just lay there for a change. Just kind of wish I could get a shower. But still, curling up under the blanket as I saw the first two go for their watch, I was just happy. Happy to be alive. It wasn't until we realized that the food would only last for so long that we began reaching out, sending patrols out, myself included. We went out to find anything we could eat. Berries, fruits, any type of vegetables that might be growing. My survival training didn't cover this type of area, so I was a bit of a loss, but thankfully a few knew what to look for. I realized there were some mushrooms still growing that we could eat, and they were plentiful, surprisingly so. However, we were more than a little hesitant to bite into the mushrooms, and I told everyone I would go first if necessary. As you know that with mushrooms, you eat the wrong one, you're dead. There's no question. But I knew which ones I was looking at. Unfortunately, I only know about 3 or 4, but it was enough. Other than that, we did find a couple of fruit trees that were not quite picked clean, mainly because the fruit itself wasn't even ripe yet. We did find a few berries, of course, but unless they're in season, berries are not exactly plentiful either. We didn't find much in the way of meat. This is what concerned us the most. We were going to run low on protein if we didn't hurry up. Eventually, we did find another river, which we started looking on the map we drew. It might be that we're just farther upstream. Could we be farther upstream? Regardless, it didn't matter. As it turns out, it was teeming with life. Whatever type of creatures were out here hunting had never thought to go into the rivers themselves. We were able to rig up some makeshift fishing poles and we're pulling out fish like all those old black and white photos. 2, 3, 4 feet long. It was glorious. I was grateful that we'd finally found a way to survive in this world. About 2 weeks later, we were out on a patrol and I heard someone yell, "Holy shit, are you kidding me?" We looked over and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was a fuel station sign sticking up in the distance. We realized if they had fuel, we could fuel the generators. So we started to make our way over. The problem is it was almost at the end of the day. So we had to go back to our security, back to our sanctuary, and then we would then move on the next morning with some sort of containers to get the fuel. The next day, it took us almost the entire day to get there, and when we arrived, our hearts sank. There were many rigs, semis, sitting there, empty. We looked around and we found a lot of the vehicles. These were civilian military type vehicles. I don't know how else to put it except they were military vehicles with civilian armor on them. This was not tactical armor at all. We saw a few vehicles actually did have tracks, which led us believe that these were the vehicles that came out from underneath the facility we were first in. And then we looked, and the vehicles were not only empty, but we found something we really didn't want. The vehicles had been torn apart, flipped over. There were bones and bloodstains everywhere. Something had fought here. We looked, there was weapons still there, still had ammo. Some were damaged, others were just left there to rot. However, whatever had happened quick. They didn't have time to get away from the pumps. Some of the vehicles just sat there, and I reached in to one of the Humvees, and I saw it didn't need a key, just was a paddle turn. I prayed to whatever God may be watching, and I turned it. It hesitated for a long time, but eventually turned over and started. There was a bunch of cheers from everyone, and then a roar came from the outside. We realized whatever had got these vehicles was around. It was still here. Everyone looked out. Everyone else who didn't have a large caliber weapon started reaching out, trying to unhook the heavy machine guns from the turrets, looking for any ammo to go into it. And we looked out. We took perimeter around the one vehicle that had started. I reached in and shut it off, and the roars stopped. It was silence. I looked at everyone, and I just said one word: inside. We all bolted for that little shopette that was there. It was our only cover from whatever was out there. And as we ran across, we could hear timbers breaking. We could hear movement out in the woods. And as we looked, several large trees were moving, but it wasn't as though there was just one creature there. There had to be more than 1, 2, 3. There was 4 trails at least. No, was it 5? I don't know. I didn't turn and look anymore. I just turned back to the building. We ran inside, and I started yelling, everyone inside the freezer now. We did. We ran in the freezer. The smell that came out of there was horrible, as everything was long since passed and was rotting. But we knew that could cover the smell, and it was one of the safest places inside the building. We stayed inside and huddled as we watched. What came out was horrid. What came out from the tree line was at least 7 of those trolls, all of different sizes. Many of them looking around, the largest one in the center of the group, stopping as he hit the road, looking left and right, peering around to see what had happened, where everything was. A smaller one to his left walked up and began to do the same thing. I looked, and it was missing part of its right arm. Somewhere mid-bicep had been blown off. It looked as though it had been burned, actually. Others, there was another one to its right, a female, and another female next to it. There was another male to his right. Strange how they split down the middle like that. Then we looked to the base, and we realized they were not alone. Other creatures came out at the same time, a little bit larger than human. These creatures ran on all fours, then stopped, and then stood. It was strange to see these things. There were different ones. Some were pale with strange elk horns type things coming out of their heads. One stood there with a dark mane all the way down with a deer skull for a face. The only thing that was still there was its eyes, which turned in different directions as it moved around, seemingly trying to sniff the air. I didn't know how it could sniff anything with no nostrils, but it was still there. All I could hear was our men saying, what is that? Do you know, what is that thing? Oh my God, is that a... They started describing different types of things I only heard in cryptid videos. As my heart began to beat so hard, I thought they could hear it from the outside. The smaller ones began to move over and began to sniff around the Humvee that I had started. And they began motioning to each other. And then ran around in different directions, continually sniffing and moving around. The large trolls began to search around, and a few disappeared from sight, yet we could hear the stomps of their feet as they moved around the building. We worried that the building wouldn't be here for very long, as we knew the trolls could easily rip it apart. That's when one of the creatures came inside. This thing, covered in a matted brown fur, covered in all sorts of grime, just opened the door, just like a normal person. Grabbed the door, pulled it open. Behind it, some sort of strange lizard. I couldn't figure out if it was a gecko, a monitor lizard, some sort of cobra. I don't know. It was all sorts of distorted, but it seemed to follow it, crawling around, seemingly licking the air with its tongue. They didn't seem to care for any of the food that was in there. None of the chips, none of the soda, nothing. They simply moved around and around. We watched through the glass, kept ourselves way to the back and as low as possible so not to be seen. The creatures came over, and we thought for a moment we were busted, as we thought that the door was going to be open and they would see us laying there. Then one cracked open the side of one of the glass case and then held back, holding its nose, and seemed to make a strange sound as though it was in pain. We realized that the stench of the food was actually doing its job. These creatures may have a strong sense of smell, but apparently it was too strong. They couldn't handle it. We realized this could be the advantage. It ran outside holding its nose, and we could hear an odd sound. We didn't know what it was until we realized that one of the trolls was pointing, and it was laughing. The creature then ran up to the troll and scratched its leg, strong enough to actually draw a slight amount of blood. The troll then kicked it off to the side with seemingly almost no effort. We realized there was a hierarchy to this group, and this was dangerous. If they took out a fully armed convoy, what the hell could we do? Everyone motioned to each other to stay down and stay quiet. We realized we still had time. We still had a chance if we stayed quiet and just let them leave. But they didn't leave. They stayed there, moving around. We could hear the twisting of metal as things opened up. We heard one of the big rigs be thrown around. It landed with a giant crash not too long or far from the building we were in. The building itself shuddered as one of the walls was ripped open. After that, several of the smaller creatures seemed to scream. I guess they wanted the building to stay intact. We don't know. We just laid there and waited, praying that someone didn't rip open the back wall and expose us. We did know that one of the creatures came in, bolted towards the bathroom, and ripped the door clean off its hinges as it went in and thrashed around, and then came out, seemingly pissed off as it knocked over a couple of the shelves. We looked at each other, still nervous, not moving, not saying a thing, and waited. It was late into the night before they left, but we still waited, listening into the dark. Could they still be out there? Could they be playing possum? Are they simply waiting for us to make a move so that we get exposed? We didn't move. We didn't talk for the rest of the night. The rest of the night was in sheer silence and sheer darkness. It seemed as though it was a new moon that night as well. Nothing was illuminated. We waited until the next morning. We waited till there was enough light that we could see. We got up, got out of the freezer. We filled our bags with whatever food we could, focusing mainly on things like protein bars. Anything that was even semi-healthy was thrown in the bags, and they must have weighed 30 pounds apiece by the time we got out. One of my number actually went and grabbed all the coffee that was there. I didn't think it was still good as it comes ground, but hey, if it works, it works. We needed resources. Slowly looking outside through one of the busted doorways, we didn't see movement. One of ours, who knew that he had a stronger sense of smell, sniffed into the air and winced at the smell that came back. We said, "What's wrong?" It's like death out there, man. It's disgusting. Hold on. Oh shit. He bolted to the bathroom to find any place to do his business, and we heard in the bathroom as he vomited for a good 2 or 3 minutes solid. We told him to put something over his nose, so that didn't happen as we walked. We did our best to get away from that area without being seen. We didn't know if we were seen, and we didn't care. We got in the tree line and we took off. We ran as fast as we could, zigzagging through the wood to make sure that we weren't being followed, stopping occasionally and listening. But nothing. We got back to the facility. Thankfully, they opened it up. They were grateful that we came back because they thought we had been lost as we didn't return the day prior. And they were even more grateful at all the supplies we had brought. We had to ration it, of course, but it was still something, anything to bring up morale. We told them what was out there. We told them we could get power to the generator, but those things were laying in wait. How could we deal with them? A plan was brought up. A very interesting plan. We sent messengers back to the original sanctuary to see if they were in on this or not. We realized that if we were to make a stand, we would have to all come together. They sent what warriors they could, but they needed enough to keep defense on their own place. We realized we had one shot at all, to take care of this situation. We lined up as much as we could as far as weapons and gear. We realized if it didn't go bang or it wasn't going to pierce something, it wasn't going to be any good. Our plan was simple. We would rush to the vehicles. We would get the heavy weapons up and running. And since we knew they were coming, they wouldn't realize that we would know how to use the weapons themselves. I had to give everyone a 1, 2, 3 class along with a couple others on how to use each weapon. The heavier weapons I would have to grab or have one of my compatriots who knows how to handle these weapons get a hold of them first so that we could get them up and running. Everyone else would basically be support to hand us ammo as we would have to hold these creatures away. 4 days later, the plan was enacted. We got to the fueling station and we realized that there was a possibility they were already watching us. On the signal, we all ran for the vehicles. We grabbed what we could. We uprighted a Humvee with the 50 cal on top. Immediately, one of our guys jumped in and reloaded, cycled the ghost round. But it wasn't long before we started to hear the roar. We began to see the trees move around again. We knew they were coming. The Humvees were started and backed away. Everybody else was loaded in. Any of the Humvees that started, any of the vehicles at all that started, we knew that if we had to get away, we had to get away quick. I reached into one and I found something I didn't think I was going to find. An actual rocket launcher. Wait, no. Oh, I thanked God above there was more than one. There was 2. They hadn't been used either. These were one shot, one use only. And I got ready, resetting the targeting reticle so it would be up close. I told everybody, don't stand behind me. Whatever you do, don't stand behind me. When the trolls began to make their entrance, they looked at us. They pointed and screamed out this horrible yell. I got the AT-4 rocket launcher on my shoulder. I looked up right at his torso. It looked down at me and it flinched. It actually flinched to turn away as one of the females burst through and seemed to have something in her hand. Holy shit, is that a tree? She began running. The big one grabbed her and forced her back, but one of the small males ran towards me. I hit the button and the AT-4 fired and the rocket came out just as the 50 cal opened up. The 50 cal made it flinch just long enough for the rocket to hit it square in the chest. The explosion, the AT round blew the chest open and the creature fell back screaming in agony. The bigger one turned and went down to it, grabbed it by the arm and dragged it back in the tree line. We didn't have to worry about the trolls. It was the other ones we had to worry about now. They came running through in a massive pack in all different directions. Weapons started swinging left, right, and center. We kept firing, laying down any type of lead we could. Those who didn't know how to handle firearms were just throwing ammo at us, bringing magazines to us, anything. Then we realized a few had gotten behind us. I turned just soon enough to see one of these things claw at me. I raised my arm and got slashed in the process. Rolling over, I heard the shots ring out as this thing was taking multiple hits and fell down in a heap. We kept firing as best we could, but we were soon running short on ammo, and we knew it. However, the creatures realized that they were severely outgunned and had this time been played. We could hear a howling, a deep, low howling off in the woods. This wasn't the howling of a wolf. This was the screaming of someone who had lost a friend. This was the scream of a parent who had lost their child. I looked down at the other rocket that had not been fired, and I picked it up and threw it in the back of the truck. I realized that the rocket had done its job, but we only had one left, and I'm not exactly going to go out and search for it. We grabbed what we could, cleaned out the little shopette that was there, looked for anything else we could salvage, and we were able to find a few fuel cans, and we began to siphon as much diesel fuel as possible. Getting it back, we finally realized we might have just made an enemy, but we had also just saved ourselves. It was decided that we would take the night off, but the next morning we would go to the generator room and fill them up. And with any luck, we'd finally see what's behind those fucking blast doors.